Kumar, if you'll hit record. We are being recorded. Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to the Conservation Finance Alliance webinar series. We've been having a series of webinars and discussions that are related to COVID-19 and the conservation finance community. And we're very excited to hold this one in continuation, building on the previous discussions we've had before. Before I get into that, just a 30-second, if in the next slide, Angie, the 30-second introduction to the Conservation Finance Alliance. It is the leading global professional alliance for conservation finance experts, practitioners, and organizations with the mission to promote awareness, expertise, and innovation in conservation finance globally. We have 4 working groups: environmental funds, protected area finance, marine and coastal conservation, and innovation. We do a range of work with environmental funds and practice standards. We've recently put out a white paper that's worth downloading from the website. We've launched earlier this year the Conservation Finance Alliance Incubator, which is hosting 15 projects and companies developing interesting, innovative approaches to conservation finance. So I won't take up any more time, but please do, keep tabs on what we're doing. We've got a lot of interesting things going on, and including 2 more webinars related to COVID and the conservation finance community, which are coming up. The next one I believe is July 2nd, and that's going to focus on mainstreaming biodiversity and development. And the reason that we're having this call today was because public-private partnerships were identified as well as mainstreaming biodiversity and development and blended finance, which will be held later in July. These were types of finance mechanisms that seem to be particularly resilient, even in the face of the economic downturn of COVID. And so we're really excited to have Angie Brathwaite from Blue Finance and a panel of excellent speakers, and Angie will introduce everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Angie. Looking forward to the discussion. Oh, just one technical issue. So as the presentations go, please write your questions into the chat box. This is not a webinar, but just a regular Zoom meeting. So we're asking everyone to make sure that their microphone is muted, and we really look forward to responding to your questions later on. Angie, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Angie Brathwaite. I'm Caribbean Coordinator for Blue Finance. And as David said, we're going to be talking about public-private partnerships today. In our context, they tend to be known as privately protected areas, PPAs, and they're perhaps the least abundant and least known of all the modes of management for MPAs. So we thought it really important to have a conversation today about the impact of COVID on these PPAs, show how they're being impacted, and see what plans they have for shoring up their financial resilience for any future shocks. So we have 3 speakers today, 3 different types of protected areas. And we're going to start with Eric Carey. Eric, can you start sharing your screen? I'm going to introduce you as you do that. So Eric is the Executive Director of the Bahamas National Trust. It's a statutory non-government organization which was created by the government to manage the national park system of the country. Eric has been with the BNT, Bahamas National Trust, for nearly 20 years and has been at its helm since 2007. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Eric. You're muted, Eric.
Can you hear me? Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, we got you now.
Still, unfortunately, multitasking in this world. So for those of For those of you who don't know, my name is Eric Carey. I run the Bahamas National Trust, which is a statutory non-government organization in the Bahamas. And I'm not sure why my slides are not advancing. All right, sorry. Okay, so who are we? So we're the National Park Service of the Bahamas. You know, we're the environmental guardians of our natural environment in the Bahamas. The national park managers, we run award-winning environmental education programs. We support and conduct scientific research. We do environmental advocacy, and we are an official advisor by law to government. We are a membership-based organization. We are a nonprofit, statutory non-government. So it means we were created by an act of parliament to be this national NGO to manage national parks. So in a lot of respects, some people consider us as a public-private partnership already, public-private partner with the government. You know, as a structured as a nonprofit, we do bring private funding and a broad network of relationships to these public spaces that we manage. And to some, we are considered as a quasi-government organization. Just you can see quickly by the numbers who we are. We manage currently 32 national parks. That's going to increase soon across the archipelago. 70 staff, managing 2.2 million acres. And we manage these unique spaces. That's our main objective. For those of you who don't know where the Bahamas is, there's the context. Just east of Cuba and east of Florida and north of Cuba, and we stretch for 1,000 miles, across the across our archipelago from northwest to southeast, and this is our network. Our impact, kids, education, and adults. But here you see kids from our Discovery Club. And also in the lower right-hand corner, you see people who are being trained as bird guides to take advantage, to become nature tour operators, to be able to take advantage of these natural spaces. And scattered amongst this slide are key species that we've worked to protect. Sharks, now $115 million industry in the Bahamas, shark dive tourism. Sea turtles are fully protected. The queen conch on the top right hand is a species that is so important for us as a culinary staple. Our track record of success: first land and sea park in the world, Exumakees Land and Sea Park. The flamingos I spoke about earlier were at the brink of extinction when the BNT was created more than 60 years ago. Now one of the greatest conservation success stories in the Americas. And the Bahama parrot, a subspecies of Amazon parrot, subspecies of the Cuban parrot, is also seeing good return to healthy populations. Our response, just like everyone else, we're adapting to this new reality. COVID-19 has closed all of our national parks, although one opened this week, the Exumakees Land and Sea Park, and another one may be opening tomorrow or Monday, the one on Eleuthera, the Levy Preserve. Most of our staff still working remotely. Our park wardens are still patrolling. A lot of our programs are going, because we have to continue protecting these national parks. So our staff are still out doing patrols. Here's one of our wardens at one of our national parks in New Providence. These two guys were actually apprehended for poaching in this national space. A little bit of what it takes to run this organization, and so why public-private partnerships are attractive to us. We need about approaching $6 million a year to run this organization, and that's increasing as we bring more parks on stream. And we invest about 2.1 million of this in salaries and benefits in our staff. So before COVID-19, 2020 was looking great. We felt we'd be able to bring in, nearly $4 million in income between now and December, between April and December. Our projection for that has shrunk because our parks are now closed and fundraising events are now onshore. So we're pretty much in a financial bind trying to figure out what to do. And what we're doing is still raising money. A lot of nonprofits went into shock but we started to talk to our donors. The good thing about the BNT is that we get funding from government, but as a nonprofit, we're able to raise funding internationally and through partnerships, like public-private partnerships with the private sector. So we've sent out lifelines for conservation, using our fundraising machineries, and we've started to get success. We believe that, the future of our country is wholly dependent on healthy environment, and the work of the BNT and the degree to which we're successful is going to help determine that. We also believe our national parks are going to be a very important part of our country's recovery strategy. People are already saying that they want to get outdoors, they want to be in the open spaces. And so so places like the Exuma Park become pretty attractive. I'm just gonna, hopefully this video runs so that you can see the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, because I'm going to talk about this briefly. Right, so I'm going to hit play. I hope you can hear it.
Eric, you may have to share a different
okay, sorry.
App there. Like you may have to unshare your screen and then reshare with the video. Yeah, there we got it.
Got it?
Grotto. But what people don't realize is that just a few miles away from these popular spots is the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, which to me is the true beauty of the Exumas. The Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park is basically a 22 by 8 mile stretch of protected area within the Bahamas that showcases a wide variety of both wildlife and biodiversity. In the north end of the park, you have Shroud Key, which is filled with creeks and mangroves that provide essential habitats for turtles and juvenile sharks and rays. In the southern end of the park, we have some beautiful rock formations. We have the Rocky Dundas cave system, which is actually two beautiful caves that have stalagmites and stalactites inside. The beaches found in the park are simply unmatched anywhere else, not just in the Exumas, but in the Bahamas. For cruisers who come to visit the Bahamas, the Exuma Park is definitely an area you can't miss. We currently have 7 mooring fields in the Exuma Park that provide a beautiful place for a cruiser or a visitor to securely moor their boat and be able to experience what we have to offer here in the park. Whether it's snorkeling or diving or hiking or simply lounging around on the beach. I mean, the experiences we offer here are unlike anywhere else in the Bahamas due to the natural beauty of the place and due to it being a protected area, and an area that has been protected now for 60 years. This is a great project that the Bahamas National Trust has going on down here in Exuma, and it's a great way to ensure that our natural resources are protected for future generations.
All right, so hopefully you saw that. I'm gonna bring back my PowerPoint just to wrap up briefly. And so, the Exuma Park, we see as an option for, so the park, you heard, it's award-winning, high visitation, a lot of income generation, pristine environment. It's remote yet accessible, great management systems in place. And we have been talking to Nicholas and Blue Finance as an example about some, opportunities for impact investment in this space. And we believe that, through nature tourism opportunities, food and beverage, our moorings, we generate a lot of money off of our moorings and anchorages. We have opportunities for space management. It's a large park that we can identify potentially areas that, we could work with private partners to manage certain spaces to generate income. So it's of financial viability for a potential, private partner. And just providing visitor experiences. So, and this is only one of 32 parks that we manage. Admittedly, not all are going to be able to have the potential of the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, but we believe that here in the Bahamas, this park and other parks offer good opportunities for public-private partnerships. And with that, I've just 10 minutes, and so I'll wrap up now. And if you need to get in touch with me, the hosts have my contact. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. If you could stop sharing your screen now, I'm going to start to share mine. But thank you very much for that presentation. So what I didn't mention before is that our three presenters will speak for about 10 minutes. We're not going to be draconian about the time frame, but we did want to leave about 30 minutes to have a discussion at the end. So from here, I'm going to introduce Eleanor. And give me 1 minute so I share my screen with you.
Hi, everybody.
And again, while Angie's finding her place there, just don't forget to, if you think of questions as we go along, please do write them in the chat box, and then we can get to them afterwards. Thanks.
Found it. Okay, Eleanor was the first project manager of Chumbe Island, and this is one of the first private marine nature reserves self-sustaining in the world. She was involved in the establishment and the setup of the project nearly 25 years ago, through to full sustainable operations. Eleanor has since stayed on in an advisory capacity with the project, and her role is now Deputy Director in recent years. She is currently based in Indonesia, where she founded and runs a consultancy practice that's provided support to protected areas and conservation. Over to you, Eleanor.
Great, thanks very much, Angie. So we do have a limited time, so let's launch right in. The Chumbe case is quite different to the case you just heard from Eric. If we go to the first slide, Angie. So Chumbe is an island just off the coast of Zanzibar in Tanzania, and it's managed by a private entity known as Chumbe Island Coral Park, or CHICOP, which was a company established in 1992. And it was actually CHICOP that campaigned with the government of Zanzibar to establish the island as a marine protected area. And this was successfully achieved in 1994. And at that time, management agreements were signed between the government of Zanzibar and CHICOP for full management of the MPA as a private sector partner. So the overall concept of the project right from the beginning was to utilize business principles to generate revenue for MPA management and operations through ecotourism. And because of that, we became the first privately managed MPA in the world. And if you can scroll down a bit, I can't see the full screen there. Yeah, that's it, okay. Yeah, we can carry on to the next slide. So at CHICOP, at Chumbe, we have three pillars that we operate to, and these are conservation, education, and ecotourism. And CHICOP as a business is a not-for-profit enterprise. So 100% of the revenue generated from tourism operations goes into running the MPA and the education programs. So if we go on to the next slide. So let's just, I'm going to very quickly go through these. On the conservation area, there are two elements, marine conservation and terrestrial. The marine, we have a reef sanctuary that's 100% no-take zone. So there's no fishing or extractive activities allowed. CHICOP is responsible for all of the management of that area, so including outreach, community engagement, daily ranger patrols, and most of our team, particularly the are actually former fishers from the communities near Chumbe. So they are responsible for patrolling and managing the area, undertaking biophysical monitoring, et cetera, because we have been operational for more than 2 decades, which is a long time, we have arguably the largest data set in East Africa for the region. And our management agreement for the reef sanctuary is a 10-year renewable agreement with the government of Zanzibar. So we're now in our 3rd phase of that. We're on our 3rd renewal of that already. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. So on the terrestrial side, we have a forest reserve. likewise, that's got 100% protection level. It covers more than 90% of the island and includes a coral rag forest and a small mangrove area. We've got a very high biodiversity on the island, including some actually critically endangered species, such as the Adastaica antelope. And our management agreement for the forest reserve is a 30-year agreement, again, renewable with the government of Zanzibar. So if we carry on to the next slide. Okay, so our second pillar is education. We have an on-site education center on the island, and our biggest program is really the schools program. So we run a very extensive education program for school children, bringing them over to the island, as well as in-school training and education. We run award schemes. We also deliver teacher training. There isn't a lot of curricula for marine conservation or sustainable development. So we've been very much developing that with the Ministry of Education and with teachers. We provide training to community groups and fisher groups, universities, etc., and also governments. So as MPAs have started to develop in other parts of the country and in other regions along East Africa, you know, we've actually supported providing training to those partners as well, and to NGO organizations, because we've been going quite a long time. Okay, so all of this work is funded through ecotourism, and we have an eco lodge on the island, which is 7 bungalows, and these have been built with state-of-the-art eco-technology and eco-architecture. So these bungalows have pretty much zero impact on the environment. They're award-winning bungalows, and they're very unusual. We have no fresh water source on the island, so everything relies on rainwater collection systems, composting toilets, grey water filtration. All our electricity is solar powered, and we have a very tightly managed carrying capacity of a maximum occupancy of 18 overnight guests on the island at any one time. So we're pretty high end. We charge between $260 to $280 per person per night, all inclusive. And you get to be a part of this active project on the island. We also run limited day trips, depending on lodge occupancy, for less money, and all of the visitors who come to the island get to take part in activities that are ranger-led. So we have guiding rangers taking snorkeling, forest trail, sailing around the island, all sorts of activities like that. If we go on to the next slide. Okay, so what is this public-private partnership framework? Sorry for the slide, lots of writing. I won't go through all of this, but basically to explain it, our main partner in the government is the Ministry of Agriculture, Natural Resources, Livestock and Fisheries. So that's who we have our management agreements with. But in addition to that ministry, we report to and collaborate with a range of other agencies, ministries, departments. We are required to submit quarterly reports, annual reports. We have different we deal with different elements with different agencies. So it's quite a complex arrangement in that sense, but our management agreements are with that one Ministry of Agriculture. In addition to the government relationships, we have an advisory committee that meets regularly to support the management of Chumbe. And this is really to engage local stakeholders and make sure there's an inclusive participatory approach to running the MPA. And that advisory committee includes representatives from local government, from local communities, the village leaders, elders, various representatives from government agencies and different ministries, as well as university representatives, and of course ourselves, CHIPOP. And I've just got this right-hand bar here before we go in. I think what's interesting about this PPP arrangement is that through this arrangement, we have a lot of strong local support. I can't actually read it on the slide here, but I think it's worth mentioning that because of these management agreements and as a private sector, privately managed MPA, we get no funds from the state. So the state doesn't pay any money towards MPA management at all. In addition to that, because we generate money through a business element, through ecotourism, we are liable to pay the same taxes, permits, licenses, and everything else as any regular profit-making business. So we don't get any tax or financial allowances for being a not-for-profit organization. And I think that's quite important. Zanzibar hasn't yet got to the stage where it recognizes that. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So very quickly, in terms of investment and financial sustainability, to set up Chumbay cost around $1.2 million. And this money came from a range of sources. Around 50% of it was private contribution from Sibylla, who is on this call with us. And we opened the lodge in 1998, so a long time ago now, and saw a very steady increase in occupancy quite rapidly in the early years, up to a fairly stable, fluctuating in recent years revenue. And in terms of proportional expenditure of that revenue, as I said, 100% goes back into the project. Around 60% of it is needed to actually run the eco lodge operations. We are quite high end, obviously food for guests, transport, etc. Around 15% annually goes to the education program, another 15% to the patrol and surveillance, and around 10% to all of our different monitoring activities. So if we go on to the next slide. So very quickly, in terms of key achievements, we have been operational more than 2 decades now. So we've seen incredibly effective biodiversity conservation, rapid increase in fish biomass over the years, supporting local food security with a spillover effect. We get high levels of local support and compliance because of that. We've been around a very long time. The fishers know us, they respect the MPA. We are working on conservation of endangered species, and our education program has trained many thousands of students and stakeholders over the years. We have won a lot of various awards for our work, and what I think is most important, though, is that we've become a model for financially self-sustaining protected areas. So we really are entirely self-financed model as private sector. So this is the not so happy information, the impact of coronavirus. And I think it's interesting, as Eric mentioned, you have to keep on managing the parks, whether they're revenue or not. And of course, like everywhere, we've experienced an abrupt halt to tourism. So we have absolutely zero revenue from our tourism operations now. Our lodge is closed. We are offering arrangements, trying to get a little bit of money coming in for future bookings as much as we can. And we do have an internal CHICOP buffer fund, but it is limited. And this is money we've set aside over the years for a rainy day, for unforeseen circumstances, which COVID-19 certainly. And our priorities right now are supporting the team and supporting island security. So we have had to reduce, obviously, salaries and the like. We're fortunate. Many businesses, many tourism businesses have simply gone out of in Tanzania. They've simply closed down and the staff have lost their jobs. We are not doing that. All of our team continue to have health insurance for their families, themselves. We've arranged a stipend to make sure they can cover their basic needs and living costs. And we have a skeleton staff still operational on the island, the rangers for patrolling and managing, etc., because that has to continue, of course. And we developed a 4-stage response plan to COVID-19 way back when the pandemic was first announced, and we are now in stage 4 of that. So if we go to the next slide. So after more than 20 years of self-sustainability, we are facing a challenge like never before, as Sibylla has said. And I think one of the things we're seeing through this is that having a single source revenue generation can be incredibly reliable with tourism, and it has held us for more than 2 decades, but it can be vulnerable, it can be impacted. And so we're seeing now that there is a need for alternate support and for alternate revenue streams to get through this period of downturn. If we carry on to the next slide. So in the immediate term, we have been launching fundraising appeals, and we've also been looking at project-based donor-funded support while the lodge is closed, so that we can be having particular projects to be getting on with and to keep some fund generation coming through. But in the future, what we're more interested in is looking at some sort of foundation, some sort of collective that can support private protected areas like ourselves, because we are reliant on certain revenue streams. We don't have state funding or support, financial support. And so we're interested to bring together other PPAs, other privately managed protected areas, and other non-state conservation entities to really have a platform where we can support one another, share lessons learned, provide technical support, but also provide a platform for security where we can actually have a fund generation scheme such as trust or endowment or a blended finance to provide buffer support to private sector entities like ourselves through these types of periods, which hopefully won't come up very often. But at the same time, it is necessary to have that financial backing beyond reliance on revenue generation solely. So I think if we go to the, I think that's about it. Tried to keep it to 10 minutes, a bit of a brain splurge through. Could talk a lot more on different elements of it, but hopefully that's given a general overview of the public-private partnership that Chumbe is. It's a quite unique model and some of the impacts we are facing through coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. And again, we're not going to be total sticklers for time. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. And we're going to go to our final speaker now, Nicolas Pascal. Nico, if you can start sharing your screen, please. Nicolas Pascal is the director of Blue Finance, which is a social enterprise dedicated to developing sustainable financing solutions for MPAs. So Nico is going to present the approach of Blue Finance, our approach, and some risk mitigation strategies for project sites.
Good. Thank you, Angie, and nice to be part of this discussion. Yeah, as you mentioned here, we will share with you very briefly a little more about this interesting model of co-management or PPP for marine protected areas. As Eric mentioned it and Eleanor mentioned it too, is not something new. I think it has been around for many years. It's not so well known amongst the NGO and the conservation world. So I think it was interesting to push through this webinar and to show also how this kind of approach that has been quite reliable over the years has also some strength regarding to the COVID situation that I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to share my screen and present you very briefly what is doing Blue Finance. So basically, as Blue Finance, we start from what I will start where the two other presenters finished, which is basically we have a financing gap. We know that government and philanthropy will not be enough, so we have to think out of the box, and we have to see what we can do with private sector or the non-profit sector. Okay, so some MPAs, that's the case, for example, of Exumakeys, it's a case of CHICOP, can become financially sustainable, but they are basically lacking upfront capital and basic and social entrepreneur skills. I think it's not enough to have an idea of business, you have also to implement it, and sometimes you need some specific skills to run ecotourism or to deal with tourism or to deal with other mechanisms like blue carbon. You have to have some specific skills that are not so common into the marine conservation world. On the other side, and this is where also Blue Finance plays a direct role, is that you have a growing number of impact investors, donors, we call them blended finance actors, that have a clear need for a pipeline of projects with a tangible business model. So here we're dealing with companies, investors, donors that are looking for projects that can become financially sustainable. Okay. So it's a mix of some of them are looking also for a reduced financial return. Some others are just looking for refundable grant, and some others are merely donation. But all of them are sharing one approach. They want their financing to contribute to the financial sustainability of MPAs. So basically, the way we approach it as Blue Finance is we're relying on three main approaches. The first one is really we need this PPP, this lease agreement, this co-management agreement signed with government for the management of the MPA. So you have several options here, several gradients. I think the BNT is a specific case of a statutory agency. A CHICOP is a perfect scholar case of a non-profit, of an MPA run by a non-profit with a clear a lease agreement or co-management agreement. What we develop with our projects is really with the local entities that will co-manage the MPA is a tangible revenue model. How are you going to become financially sustainable? What is your approach? How are you going to generate your revenues? It can be a mix of different models. And we obviously, under the COVID, we are trying to diversify these revenue models. What are your skills? Who's going to implement these revenues? All of these belong to the part of the this tangible revenue model. And the third one is once we have a PPP, once we have a clear vision of how this PPP and these local partners are going to become financially sustainable, okay, let's see if they need some upfront capital and how investors and donors can help and accelerate this project. So very briefly, the co-management, and I think it's quite repetitive with what CICOP did. So we have not here adding a lot, but I think it's important to remember that this co-management is really done with a non-profit entity. There's no today MPA run really by a for-profit entity, not to my knowledge at least. So in our case, what we recommend is to create a new entity formed by local NGOs and communities. And this is this entity that will sign the co-management lease. In the case of Bahamas, obviously, where the BNT is already existing, the idea is to work with a BNT. This entity, as Elena mentioned it also, receive guidance and monitoring from a multi-stakeholder co-management advisory board. The idea is really for the entity to be in charge of the day-to-day management, and will receive some proper scientific and governance advice from government and from civil society. Ministries, government, they maintain the core function. We're not dealing here with any concession. This is not any transfer property. It's really a delegation of management, right? Where you're going to share the day-to-day management. In terms of financial and what we're trying to structure, we try to provide up to $3 million as a blended finance solution that can be provided as initial funding for the MPAs. Obviously, this funding will be directed to equipment, vessels, scientific equipment, visitor center, and so on, and will cover also part of the working capital. The entity is that we work on the different business model with this co-management entity. So the low-hanging fruit and what we have seen with most of these PPP for MPA, that the main model which is coming out is based on tourism. Okay, so we have been focusing our effort on our projects so far on tourism through statutory user fees, dive fees, snorkeling fees. Anyone entering the MPA might or have to pay a user fee. We are obviously dealing with mooring fees, but we are also implementing other innovative models like some multimedia or digital visitor center to diversify the revenues, not only focusing on the tourism based on the MPA, but also outside of the MPA. We are exploring in 2 countries blue carbon credits, so that's already dealing with some potential off-takers. So voluntary credit a market, so it's more like a boutique a blue carbon credit, but is quite promising in terms of revenues, and obviously creating a diversification of revenue. We're looking at biodiversity offsets. We're working also with some specific fishery to see how they can participate into the MPA management cost. And we are also exploring other options like a social or impact bond for the kind of MPAs. Okay, so that's part of the solution of a financing approach that we can have. Obviously, it is important also for the entity not to have a plan, but also capacities to implement this. And with Blue Finance and other partners, and if needed, obviously, there's a technical support that can be provided to improve these social entrepreneur skills into the MPA. I repeat, most of the MPAs are run from an ecological or scientific background, so it's important to bring this approach as entrepreneur there, just to be covering this. So risk mitigation, obviously, this is part also of the approach of the business model. How do we deal with risk? So we have already done this before COVID. Regarding COVID specifically, we are dealing here with an unknown situation. We're still in the middle of it, and I think tourism has been one of the most impacted sector. There are several projections done by the UN WTO, depending mostly on how fast or when are we going to reopen the borders. So we're still in this. We know that the model is obviously deeply affected for 2020, and we are projecting a 2021 recovery. And the slope of this recovery will depend on several factors, depending on each country. The ratio of national, international tourism, what are the safety conditions offered by the country or by the site, and so on. So we're working, for example, in Cape Verde, we're working in Philippines towards the communication effort that can be done to reassure tourists and visitors of the safety conditions that can be secured for the visitors. Regarding and more concretely, we are working with 2 insurance brokers to try to develop a product. Can be specific to a pandemic, but also specific to hurricanes or extreme climate event, which is a business interruption coverage. It's an insurance. You pay a premium every year, and when the event happens, you will receive some payment from the insurance company. And in that case, what we're targeting is to cover the minimum OPEX. So the same as Eric and Eleanor was mentioning before, if they have an insurance that can provide 6 months of operational expenditures, mostly staff and basic costs for surveillance, that would be very welcome. So we're working on this. There are several insurance companies that are also interested in the impact solution. So they might work a little less expensive than a regular company. So that's quite also very interesting, and we'll be very happy to share where we can go with this. I repeat, this is still in discussion. It's very advanced for hurricane and other climate events. Obviously, in the pandemic, the insurance company are still in the calculations of how much is the premium and when the next COVID-21 is going to happen. And I'm touching wood, obviously, nothing is going to happen again. Other mitigation, and what was part of a business as usual business model, is revenue diversification. This can be horizontal. We can deal with different kind of tourists, national, international, with a different exposure to this kind of travel restrictions that we have seen under COVID. It can be vertical. So we're diversifying the source of income, e.g. tourism, but also a carbon market, or with a fishery, having a different blend of revenues here. And volatility. We know that, for example, the mass tourism is very respondent to any crisis. It's very resilient also. I mean, the recovery is quite fast, but the impact can be very deep and very quick. Meanwhile, ecotourism can have other kind of resilience. So the idea is to mix and to reduce the exposure to risk. On the other side, and knowing now that some MPAs can have a financial burden through a debt instrument or through a refundable grant, it's important also to negotiate very flexible financial conditions. And here, I repeat, we are dealing with a non-traditional financiers, so they're very keen to find an agreement. They were very keen to reduce any financial burden on the MPA. Their approach is, okay, we need some financial discipline. This has to be payback, but obviously under extreme or unplanned events, there's a lot. There's a scope for flexibility, and there's a scope for negotiation over terms. And with this, I think I'm out of time, but basically Blue Finance today, we have projects in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, and Western Africa. 2 MPAs are already under active management. 5 are in a structuring phase where we are all developing the PPP or developing the business model with a co-management entity. And we have others that are much more in incubation. We hope, and it makes a lot of sense, that this model will develop. All of our MPAs have been selected with governments based on co-management and other kind of feasibility, and obviously the existence of local support. So this is our hope. We really hope that this model is going to come more present. It makes a lot of sense. It's a turnkey solution for government. It will allow government today in this COVID context to focus their limited resources to other MPAs or to other priorities. So we know that this solution is not for 20,000 MPAs, but there's a reduced number of them that can be targeted, and where government can really delegate this day-to-day management and leave it to this non-profit sector to make it financially sustainable and properly managed. And with this, I will finish. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so that is it for our panelists. So we've heard from two essentially managers who are directly managing marine protected areas, and then we've also heard from an NGO sorry, an NGO, Blue Finance, that is actively working with MPAs and working with PPPs and looking at ways in which sustainable financing can be made stronger. Okay, so I am checking to see if there are any queries, any questions for the panelists. Okay, I can start with one. It's actually for Eleanor. Again, many of us know very, very little about privately funded and managed marine protected areas. And you mentioned that the government provides no income or it provides no funding, no financing at all for the MPA. So I was wondering, in a COVID scenario, I'm sure the government has seen over the years, you've been there for quite a long time, so the government has been able to see the positive impacts of the MPA. So I was just curious, in this sort of scenario, I know that their finances are stretched also, but have they even offered any sort of assistance to the marine park? Anything? What has the government's response been to the MPA?
Honestly, right now, but particularly because of coronavirus, the government's focus right now is simply trying to stay afloat itself. So in terms of the MPA, no, it's not interested at all to provide support there. I mean, they're struggling to provide enough support to hospitals. And don't forget, we're talking about East Africa here. So this is it's a relatively impoverished area already. Their priorities do lie in a very different direction. And so, if anything, the government is actually developing sort of new policies to try and increase taxes on tourism, increase revenue into the government from conservation and from tourism operations. So it's actually the reverse. So, so unfortunately, I would love to be able to say, oh yes, they're going to step up and help, but it just isn't the case. And it's understandable to some extent, when particularly in an area like East Africa, where there are certain resources in terms of expenditure have to go on immediate needs of people there. Yeah, so I hope that answers it.
It does. I have another one, but there's Sean. Sean, do you want to unmute yourself and that's your question from Sean Nazarali?
Yes, thanks, Angelique, and thank you, both of you. I missed the first presentation, unfortunately, but I caught both the second ones. Just a comment for Eleanor. It's exactly that. I work for BioFund, which is the National Conservation Trust Fund in Mozambique, and we are just putting together, I've actually just released it half an hour ago, a call for all privately managed protected areas to apply for support from the BioFund to keep basic ranger operations going during the COVID crisis for all of those that are directly dependent on tourism. We have a large hunting industry in Mozambique that keeps about 2/3 of our protected area system afloat and functioning, and they have no income as well. So we've just decided to liberate a chunk of our endowment funds to try to support that sector. So I don't have a second. I don't have a
Fantastic.
second for you, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You're 200 kilometers too far north. But I did have a question for Nicholas, which was nice to see you here, Nicholas. I was wondering a little bit more about your investors. Sorry, children screaming. What kind of returns are they looking for to be involved, and what kind of sort of return periods are they looking at in order to be interested in going into this park management? Because one of the issues we face, of course, is that it takes quite a while for places that need co-managers to then turn around and start making money. And that's often too long and too low a rate of return to interest your normal commercial investors. Thanks.
Hi, Sean. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, there's a lot of different profile of investors and donors. So that's why with the term blended finance, we try to mix it. So we have a case, for example, in Dominican Republic, where we are dealing with an MPA with a very consolidated destination and tourism structure. We've already a lot of visitors inside the MPA. So here, obviously, we are targeting more investors that have a closed-end fund. So they have to basically, there's a term, very clear term for the loan, and they have some clear expecting rate of returns. That's the impact investor by definition. In that case, it is adapted to situation like in Dominican Republic. In other cases where the business model is tangible, but we forecast that it will need an incubation and a development much longer than 2, 3, or 4 years, we have different options, and we can blend it with donors, we can blend it with donors giving refundable grants, and we can also blend it with some impact investors that have a longer term. At this stage, really the preoccupation regarding the rate of return is important, but I won't put it as a primary concern. It's a secondary one. Obviously, it can be an issue for some projects, but in most of the cases, with a blended finance approach, we can really succeed in having a very low rate or lower than market. So that's not really the focus. I hope I have responded to your question.
Okay, I'm going to add. Sybil is on the call, and she wanted to add just a bit to what Eleanor had said about Chumbi. So I'm going to just ask Sybil if she can introduce herself properly. I didn't do it, and please add what you wanted to add.
Okay, thanks, and Angie. I'm the founder of Chumbe. I'm also the owner of the company, 99%. And my background is actually aid industry. I've been working with GTZ for nearly 20 years before starting Chumbe. Now, what Eleanor said is totally true. The attitude of the government is actually not really to support private parks. We don't have private parks in Tanzania. It's really a government monopoly. Parks are actually government property, and the only other case is one hunting concession of Paul Tudor Jones, which is a hedge fund billionaire, and that's a very different situation west of Serengeti. Now, our situation now being so critical in terms of financial sustainability, we have started several project applications with donors, among them GIZ, Emergency Fund for Corona, etc. And they do look promising, but of course these are funds which will be paid into our account and will attract taxes like any other fund going into our accounts. So, and we will use this as a test case. Yeah, once we get the approval by the donor, and it will be difficult to actually get donor aid, which then is taxed by the recipient country. That's always a condition normally of funding going into accounts that it's not taxed. So we will negotiate with the government of Zanzibar in this case, because this will be a joint project together with the Ministry of Education to introduce swimming lessons, safety in water lessons into schools, because we want to expand our education program. Swimming skills is very limited in Zanzibar. Most of the kids, if not all, coming to the island have to wear life vests and hang on car tubes, so they're really scared of the water. So we want to address this in a project with the ministry, and they're actually quite interested in doing that. And this we will then use as a leverage to say, look, we are ready to support there. We can get donor fund for this, but can you, and legally they can you exempt us from the taxes? Yeah, in this case, VAT, which is 18%. So that will be a test case for us to, well, create awareness in government that we are providing a not-for-profit service. Yeah, and it sounds unbelievable. This takes more than 20 or 30 years, actually. When I started negotiating, this was 91, so it's nearly 30 years that we have been doing this. But it's really not in the mindset of government in East Africa. Well, Kenya, it's different, but in Tanzania, it's so very unusual, it's too hard to believe. So that was in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Sybil. We have another question from Kathy Mickerton. Would you like to ask the question, Kathy?
Sorry, a bit of trouble unmuting. Yeah, hi, Nicola. You had mentioned use of lease agreements in this case. So what's the time horizon on the lease agreements and why leases? And if the example you gave of using capital was to purchase, in fact, some tangible assets, to whom do they actually belong?
Okay. Basically, so it's a lease. It's a management lease agreement. I think the procedure is important. So this management lease is really between government and the special purpose entity, this non-profit entity. The assets will be on the name of this lessee entity. Just to visualize it, basically the government will sign this management lease with this co-management entity for 10 or 15 years. And this co-management entity will be in charge of the day-to-day management and will have to purchase by its own all the equipment and pay all the staff without help from government. That's more or less the solution we're trying to, we'll be trying. But it's been developed in Dominican Republic, in Philippines, and has been developed on other locations.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. But does that present any risk to government if it doesn't work out and the co-manager pulls out and in fact can leave with everything?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, but here, okay. Basically, the agreement is based on a standard public and private partnership agreement. So every year there's a clear monitoring of the performances, just to be sure that the lessee entity or the co-management entity is performing as expected. In case of not, there's a clear protocol and procedure to be followed, and government can easily terminate the contract in that case. What happened with the assets in that case? Normally, the assets belong to the lessee entity, and the lessee entity will be the one in charge of paying back investors or in charge of all the financial commitments that have been taken by it. Government here doesn't assume any responsibility of this. So the assets will belong to the co-management entity.
Okay, thank you.
There we go.
Okay, we're going to take just two more questions. There's one from Marcio Aron. Marcio, would you like to give your question? I'm gonna give it as if I'm not sure you're still there. But Marcio is from an NGO that's been managing the Cayos Cochinos Natural Marine Monument in Honduras for 26 years. They have a coral restoration program, and they want to strengthen it. So he's asking if your collaboration is possible for these type of activities. Nicola.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we are now in a phase of exploring new projects. So we'll be very happy to understand a little more what has been done there and what can be done. I repeat, one of the important aspects is revenue generation. We really focus, and that's the point. The point is not to replace government. the point is not to replace donors. It's really to accelerate or facilitate MPAs that have potential to create some revenues. So the first approach here will be to sit with Marcio and just have an informal discussion about feasibility in terms of revenue, of the different scope of potential revenues here, and the legal framework behind it, just to explore this collaboration.
Okay, and there's a final one. We didn't get very many COVID-related questions, but that's okay, because I still think that many people don't know about privately managed MPAs, so we're learning a lot. And the final question is from Lorna, and she's curious about if your model is similar to that of African parks, and if you work with African parks at all.
Is it for who?
It's for Nicola.
We know quite well about African Park Network. The model in terms of co-management is exactly the same. The difference is that APN is mostly financed through classic financing channels, meaning donors, philanthropy, and some of them with ecotourism. But if I'm not wrong, 60 to 70% of their revenues, which are huge, because they're managing like 20 or 25 parks, it's a huge co-management entity. I think 60 to 70% of their revenues are coming from donations. And this is something we try to avoid or to diversify, thinking really of MPAs financially sustainable and independent from grantors, obviously when it is possible. So I would say yes, the co-management entity and model is exactly the same or very similar. We diversify or we change a little bit in terms of the revenue generation.
Okay, and the final question, I know I said two more, but the final question is from me to Eric, actually, with the Bahamian parks. So it seems a little bit like you are changing your focus a little bit to look at local tourism. Am I right? And if so, or do you have any other ways of financing other than tourism?
Oh, yeah, so thank you very much. So we are looking obviously to increase tourism within the parks that can support it, clearly ensuring that we have carrying capacity issues addressed. But what we've been hearing as our, the Bahamas depends, as many of you may know, heavily on tourism. That's our number one industry. And as we think about opening up our country amidst this unknown reality, what becomes a new normal, we're hearing that people do want to get outside more. I mean, large travel agents are talking to our government saying that people want experiences outside. So we haven't finalized the strategy, but we certainly believe that there are opportunities for outdoor experiences in national parks that can support, small eco lodges, for example, etc. So yes, we are going to be exploring more, getting visitors services enhanced and more opportunities for nature-based tourism in national parks. But that is not the only way that we're looking at, bringing more tourists. We're also looking to capitalize on the existing level of tourism to these national parks. So trying to tap into an existing market, not just really increase the number of people, but get more money out of the people who are already visiting. Okay.
Thank you very much, Eric, Eleanor, and Nicola. Thank you very much for really very interesting presentations. I'm going to hand back over to David at this point to give the final words, and just thank you also to everyone who joined us.
Yeah, thanks. No, I know where we've run over time. I really appreciate everyone staying in there, and just wanted to give a big thanks to Angie for helping organize this, and Sean Nazarelli for starting the whole COVID discussion off way back over, I guess, around a month and a half ago. So stay tuned for the next series of webinars, and very much appreciate all of our panelists' participation and all of our participants listening in. Thanks very much. And bye-bye, everyone. Stay safe, stay well.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Angie.
bye.
Facilitation.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.